The crown was a lie. King Kaushika realized this only when he was standing knee-deep in the ashes of his own pride. He was a man who commanded the earth. When his chariot moved, the ground shook. When he spoke, borders were redrawn in blood. He believed that absolute physical force was the only law the universe respected. But as the smoke cleared in the quiet forest, he looked at his hands. They were empty. He looked at the old man sitting quietly on the dirt before him. The man had no armor, no army, no gold. And yet, in a single afternoon, this frail hermit had taken everything the king possessed, and he had done it without striking a single blow. The ruin of King Kaushika began with an act of arrogant hospitality. Months earlier, the king had been marching his massive army across the continent. 1 million men dragged their feet through the dirt. They were exhausted, parched, their armor suffocatingly heavy, their horses starving and foaming at the mouth. They carried the grim smell of sweat, copper, and endless conquest. Eventually, the tree line broke, and the staggering vanguard spilled into the edge of a deep, ancient forest. It was the domain of Sage Vashishta. Vashishta was a Brahmarshi. He was a being who had burned away all worldly desires through decades of absolute stillness. His ashram was a place of profound, terrifying peace. In this forest, predators and prey drank from the same river. The air was heavy with the smell of lotus flowers and the faint, sweet smoke of sacred fires. The king stepped down from his chariot, expecting the hermit to offer him a handful of bitter berries, or perhaps drop to his knees and beg for his life. Instead, Vashishta looked at the starving army and offered to feed them all. Kaushika thought it was a joke. 1 million men stood behind him, their stomachs hollow, their weapons heavy. The surrounding woods could not possibly hold enough meat and grain to satisfy a fraction of his cavalry. But Vashishta did not call for hunters. He simply called for Sabala. She stepped out from the deep shade of the trees, a celestial cow, her skin glowing with a faint, divine light. She breathed, and the air suddenly smelled of fresh rain. She was a creature of pure, living warmth. Vashishta walked to her and whispered gently into her ear. The earth simply yielded. The transformation was violent in its suddenness. Rivers of sweet milk and honey flowed directly from the soil. Mountains of roasted meats, rich pastries, and warm rice erupted before the stunned soldiers. Every man, every horse, every war elephant ate until they could not force down another bite. Kaushika stood completely isolated amidst his gorging men. He did not feel gratitude. He felt a deep, twisting sickness in his gut. He felt the terrifying sting of envy. He was the undisputed ruler of the known world. But to feed his empire, he had to bleed it. He needed swords, forced taxation, brutal harvests, and fear. This hermit living in the dirt held more wealth in a single tethered animal than the king held in his entire bleeding empire. Kaushika approached Vashishta. The king's pride could not tolerate the existence of a power he did not own. A jewel of this magnitude belongs only in the treasury of a king, Kaushika said, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his sword. I will give you 100,000 ordinary cows. I will give you mountains of gold. Give me Sabala. Vashishta looked at him. His eyes held no anger, only a quiet, terrifying pity. She is not property, king. She is my family. She is the sacred fire of this ashram. She cannot be bought. Kaushika smiled. It was the cold, hollow smile of a man who had never been told no. A king does not ask, hermit. A king takes. Kaushika raised his hand and gave the fatal order. His royal guard moved in. They showed no reverence for the divine light. They threw thick, heavy iron chains around Sabala's neck, the metal biting deeply into her glowing skin. They dug their heels into the dirt and began to drag her away by brute force. Sabala thrashed against the iron. She dug her hooves deep into the soil, weeping large, heavy tears that steamed as they hit the ground. She looked back at Vashishta. Her wide eyes asked a silent, desperate question. Why have you abandoned me to these savages? Vashishta remained perfectly still. He offered no curses and raised no guard. He only looked at the weeping animal, and spoke in a perfectly calm voice. "I have not abandoned you, but I am a man of peace. I cannot commit violence. If you wish to be free, you must free yourself." The moment those words left his lips, the air pressure in the forest dropped violently. The birds stopped singing. Sabala stopped weeping. The faint, divine light surrounding her body suddenly turned a blinding, furious red. The tears that had fallen into the dirt began to boil. From her breath, from her skin, from the boiling mud beneath her hooves, flesh and steel began to tear their way into reality. They did not just appear. They ripped themselves out of the light, fully armed, screaming in strange, guttural tongues. These were the Pallavas, the Shakas, the Yavanas. Fierce foreign warriors born purely from the wrath of a violated mother. There were tens of thousands of them, and they looked at the king's army with absolute murder in their eyes. They hit Kaushika's men like a tidal wave of blades. The slaughter was absolute. It was not a battle. It was a butchery. The king's elite guard, the men who had conquered continents, the veterans who had survived 100 campaigns, they were turned to meat in minutes. Swords shattered against the divine armor of the foreign warriors. Horses screamed as they were dragged to the ground. The earth quickly turned into a thick, red swamp. Kaushika stood frozen, unable to draw his weapon, watching the men who had built his empire be dismantled piece by piece. In less than an hour, it was over. The screams faded into a wet, heavy silence. The foreign warriors dissolved back into the dirt, leaving Sabala standing quietly beside Vashishta. Kaushika was left standing alone in a sea of his own dead men. The steel that had held his empire together was entirely gone. Humiliated, something inside his mind snapped. He left his dead where they fell. If physical weapons were obsolete, he would acquire divine ones. Kaushika fled into the freezing, jagged peaks of the Himalayas. He abandoned his silk robes. He stood on one leg in the blistering snow for months. He starved himself until his skin clung tightly to his ribs and his vision blurred. He punished his own flesh, screaming prayers into the howling wind, demanding the attention of Lord Shiva. The cosmic laws of asceticism are strict. They do not answer to a man's character. They answer only to the heat of his penance. Extreme suffering generates a localized disturbance in the universe, and eventually, the gods must answer. Shiva manifested from the snow. Bound by the physical laws of tapasya, the god granted the broken king his wish. He gave Kaushika the knowledge of the celestial astras. These were not mere swords or spears. They were weapons of cosmic destruction. Arrows that carried the power of storms, boiling oceans, and absolute death. Armed with the fire of heaven, Kaushika walked down the mountain. He did not return to conquer. He returned to eradicate. Kaushika stood at the edge of the forest. His eyes were mad with vengeance. He raised his heavy divine bow and unleashed the arsenal. Arrows of pure fire rained down from the sky, incinerating the ancient trees. The sacred rivers boiled into steam. The peaceful animals burned alive in the underbrush. Monks fled in terror, their robes catching fire as the ashram was consumed by the wrath of the gods. The sky turned the color of dried, dead blood. Vashishta stepped out of his burning home. He still wore nothing but tree bark. He was entirely unarmed. Kaushika sneered. He reached back and drew the Brahmastra. It was the ultimate weapon, a projectile carrying the concentrated, destructive force of a dying sun. When released, it was meant to vaporize anything it touched. The king pulled the bowstring back to his ear, aimed directly at the old man's chest, and fired. The heat of the weapon boiled the clouds instantly. The sheer physical force of its flight flattened the remaining trees before the arrow even crossed the clearing. It roared like a dying sun, blinding everyone who dared to look at it. The apocalypse was seconds away from striking the hermit's flesh. Vashishta did not flinch. He reached down and picked up his Brahmadanda, his simple wooden walking stick, a piece of timber infused with decades of silent, unbroken meditation. He planted the wooden stick in the dirt between himself and the incoming fire. The Brahmastra struck the wood. There was no explosion. There was no shockwave. The wooden sticks simply absorbed the fire. It drank the atomic heat of the gods like dry earth drinking a single drop of rain. The terrifying, blinding light sputtered against the bark, choked, and died completely. The smoke slowly cleared. The stick was not even scorched. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was worse than the fire. It was the heavy, crushing silence of a universe proving a man was absolutely nothing. Kaushika's hands went numb. The heavy divine bow slipped from his grip. The sound of the wood hitting the ash echoed loudly in the quiet devastation. He stared at Vashishta. The sage was perfectly calm, his breathing steady, his eyes still holding that same terrifying pity. In that profound silence, Kaushika realized his entire life had been a joke. He realized that a mountain of swords and a sky full of divine fire were nothing. They could not even singe a piece of dead wood held by a mind that had conquered itself. Dig balam kshatriya balam, Kaushika whispered into the cold ash. Shame on the power of a warrior. Brahma tejo balam balam. Only the power of the spirit is true power. He reached up to his head. He felt the heavy, useless weight of the gold. He took off his crown and let it fall into the dirt. He unbuckled his armor, letting the thick metal plates drop to the ground. He turned his back on his kingdom, his remaining wealth, and his name. King Kaushika died in those ashes. He walked deep into the dark woods to begin a punishment of his own making. He would sit in the fire. He would starve. He would tear his own mind apart until he forged a power greater than Vashishta's. He was about to ignite the terrifying fire of tapasya. But extreme heat cannot be contained. The fire he was about to build would warp the fabric of reality, and that kind of disturbance never goes unnoticed. It always invites a visitor. If you want to see who walks through the smoke to agitate the gods, stay with Mythkipedia.